Hi, everyone. Today we are reassessing cultural relativism. Now, the fact is, this entire time, I've sort of been, artificially constraining what relativism means. We've actually been treating only one kind of relativism in this course, but there are many different kinds of relativism. What we've been talking about is, well, it goes by a couple of different names: classical cultural relativism, moral relativism, moral cultural relativism, cultural moral relativism. I've heard all these different versions. In any case, we've been looking at relativism about morality. But in order to see relativism in its true guise, basically, we can only see the best critiques for relativism when we see it in its most general sense. So, that's what we're going to do today. So, in the most general sense, relativism is the view that assertions in a certain domain can be deemed correct or incorrect only relative to some specific framework. Whoa, what does that mean? Okay, assertions, right or wrong, relative to some specific framework. All right, the easiest way to see this is through the lens we've already been looking at this entire time: relativism about morality. So, in here, the assertions are the specific moral judgments or moral claims, and the relativist about morality is saying that an act is, you can only deem it right or wrong in the context of a moral code of a culture or a society. So let me just harp on this first half of the definition. The basic idea here is you can only say something is right or wrong in the context or in the framework of a culture. So that is maybe the most intuitive application of relativism, right, to morality. There is something else here that I should add now, and it's the second half there. No culture's moral code is privileged or advantaged relative to all the others. What that means is that you have to treat each culture as separate spheres, and that you can't really say that one is better than the other. So let's just say you have a hunter gatherer society and an industrial society. You can't really say, well, it's better to be a hunter gatherer, much simpler life, or it's better to be, in the industrialized society, there's more information and technology and science, because those are already values inside of that sphere, right? If you care about having all this technology, well, that's already a value, and it's maybe a value that isn't had by the hunter gatherer society, at least not in the same way. So you have to treat them as being completely separate, and you have to note, according to the relativist, that there is no objective framework by which you can judge them relative to each other. You can't say one is better than the other. It's just not possible. All right. Well, that is the most common form of relativism, probably. There's still something like this view around today. Um, it's morphed. It's morphed. That's what I can say. But that's why some people call it classical cultural relativism. It's sort of an evolving view that I won't get any more into that right now. What I can say is that there are other flavors of relativism. Perceptual relativism is the view that our background concepts and beliefs make it so that we live in different worlds. So I have here an example about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I guess I'll give it to you real quick. So according to this hypothesis, probably false by the way, the language that you speak affects how you see the world. So according to this view, if you speak Chinese, you literally see reality a little bit differently than if you speak, let's just say, English. So according to Chinese, there's certain words that don't really translate very well, and there's actually certain logical words that aren't used exactly as they are in English, and so you see things more holistically, whereas in English you see things more individualistically. Okay, well that's one view. Again, Sapir-Whorf, probably not true, but that would be an example of perceptual relativism. Let me give you maybe a better, more up to date example. So, I read this book called The Geography of Thought, very, very interesting. And in that book, they're talking about how people see emotions differently in different cultures, and that really is living in different worlds. So in the US, it turns out that we sort of expect people to get angry in certain contexts, and there's other cultures, in particular Eastern cultures, where anger is really not a socially accepted emotion in any context. Social harmony is valued much more. So if I see someone get upset, by the way, I've been living in the States for, I don't know, 20 something years now. So I'm basically very acculturated into American culture. If I see someone get mad over something, wrong that happened to them, something bad that happened to them, I sort of get it. Like it totally makes sense to me. Man, must be having a bad day. That might be a thought that I would have. But I think apparently what the research says is if you are like, Japanese, only speak Japanese, raised in Japan, never had, much contact with Western culture, especially, the work that was being done in these days was, pre 2000s, right? So we're talking 20th century. If you are, only existing in Japanese culture, then you might see anger as inappropriate. So I would see the angry person as like reacting adequately almost, and they would see it as very inadequate. Social harmony is supposed to be valued above everything else. So we would see literally different things, different worlds. That's a form of perceptual relativism. Very interesting, I might add. Here's another form of relativism. This, by the way, is Quine. He is kind of a big deal in 20th century philosophy. And he argued that if you're attempting to translate from one language to another, there's actually many possible translations and no way to determine the right one. So he calls this indeterminacy about translation. So he gives an example. Let's just say that you are in a totally alien culture and you see this image right here, and someone says to you, "Egobai," and so you're thinking to yourself, "Oh, that must be the word for rabbit." Well, that's not the only possible translation. That could be, "Egobai" might mean dinner, and this might be dinner for you. And later on, they catch it and they do eat it. So maybe he said rabbit, maybe he said dinner, maybe he said, rabbit parts. Why not? I mean, that's logically possible. If you see a little, bunny rabbit like this run around, you could say rabbit, or you could say rabbit parts, and that wouldn't be inaccurate, right? So Quine is saying we can't even really translate from one language to another adequately without some indeterminacy happening in there. So there's actually that's a different kind, sort of a more impossible to refute kind of relativism in there, right? And it's kind of weird, kind of skeptical. I'll give you one more here. This guy's name is Ian Hacking. You can be a relativist about reason. So we make assumptions about what counts as a good reason for holding certain beliefs, but these assumptions are precisely that, assumptions, and we don't have any ultimate grounds for justifying these assumptions. So let me give you sort of a ridiculous example. Let's just say someone believes in magic and myth, and you say, I believe in, I don't know, science and mathematics and Bayes' theorem and evidence. And so you say to them, well, you should believe in this because, evidence should be like this, and you should only believe things that you have evidence for. Well, the other person can just say something like, yeah, you have the wrong idea about evidence. Evidence comes from really old stories or myth. And, given this, I can believe in magic, right? So it might be the case that what you count as evidence actually has a bunch of hidden assumptions in there. If you're anything like me, evidence better be, if I'm really behaving, intellectually speaking, very well, evidence is like peer-reviewed articles and anything that comes down from scientific communities. That's evidence, and things that I can see myself, that counts as evidence. If you were to tell me something magical, I would say that's not evidence. I wouldn't count that as evidence. But those are just assumptions on my part. It says Hacking, this guy right here. And so, we can't really decide on that. It might be that we have the wrong assumptions about what evidence is. So that's another kind of relativism about reason, right? That's weird. Okay, all flavors of relativism. We focus on this one right here. Let's do this now. Let's see if we can sort of, break apart what's going on with classical cultural relativism now that we have this more general definition of relativism. And basically, we can break down the view into these two things. First of all, the principle of cultural coherence. Each culture constitutes a total social world, meaning that all social constructs, including values, norms, are passed on to each generation through the process of enculturation. That's this spheres thing I was talking about. In order to be in the sphere of a particular culture, you have to be acculturated into that culture. You have to grow up in it or live in it many, many years. And then you can see life through this lens. And now you're in that sphere, right? So that is how, when we grow up, that's what people do to us, right? Had I grown up in a different country, it's not like I would have had the values that I have now. I was taught these values through my upbringing. That's what, parents and family and your community does, your school, all that just is acculturation. Okay, that's one principle in there. And the other one is this one, incommensurability. Neither cultures as a whole nor their constituent social constructs can be ranked, but must be each understood as unique and not comparable to other cultures. This basically says there is no objective framework by which you can rank different cultures or different moral codes. Now we're breaking it up, right? There's a separate sphere principle, and there's the no objective framework principle. We can call it those two things. So now that we see it like this, now the criticism that I'm going to give you might make more sense. By the way, let me just say, almost like a sidebar here, but in the history of anthropology, maybe the kind of relativism that we've been studying is a good thing, even if it's ultimately wrong, right? I'm going to give you a criticism of the view right now. But implicit in that relativism that we studied was a denial of the evolutionary approach in anthropology, that some cultures are more evolved and others are less evolved. So this is now rejected in anthropology and biology, I should add, and for good reason. I mean, it's false, basically. But anthropologists were treating cultures as like, on a hierarchy. And so relativism came about and shut that out. And that's a good thing. But does that mean that it is true? Just because it has good effects doesn't always mean that it's true, right? So let me give you now some hints of a criticism. And it all has to do with incommensurability, this idea that there is no framework by which you can, judge uh, different moral codes, different cultures. Okay, so I broke it down again into two. If you think about incommensurability, there's one conceptual claim in there. It's called alethic relativism. I have not used this word before, and it's because it's scary, right? But it's really not that complicated. It has to do with relativism about truth. The truth of certain propositions, including moral claims, by the way, can only be evaluated in relation to some culture's social structure. Okay, alethic relativism is sort of a big deal here because there's that star there, right? The asterisk. Some scholars think that every flavor of relativism basically can be reduced down to this kind of relativism, which means that if this isn't true, well, then all the other kinds of relativism fall apart. So, I mean, we can teach a whole class on this. I'm not going to get into that, but some people really do think that this is at the root. So we'll look at it. If it's no good, what can we do, right? There's also, by the way, an empirical claim of the relativism that we've been looking at. This denial that there are, you know, frameworks that apply across cultures, right? There are no norms that are valid or effective across all cultures. According to this view, there is no objective lens by which you can judge different cultures. That's what we had talked about earlier. And so these are the two claims that we're going to really study. Is the truth relative? And is it really the case that there's no method by which you can compare two different spheres, two different, cultures? So let's look at that now. Let's start with the conceptual claim. We can think about these as philosophical objections or conceptual objections. And I'll begin with a very old argument against relativism. It comes from the man himself, Socrates. Actually, it comes from one of Plato's dialogues. If you don't know, Socrates is almost always, a character in one of Plato's dialogues. But we think that Socrates himself probably had a view like this. So here we go. If truth is relative, then there is no absolute truth. There's only true for you, true for me, true for them. Okay, that just is, in a way, the definition of relativism or alethic relativism. But relativism itself is a claim to truth, right? Relativism itself can either be true or false. So, relativism can be true for the relativist and false for someone else. What? In other words, relativism seems to be self defeating. Here's how this goes down. If you walk up to me and you say, hey man, relativism is true, there's no absolute truth. By your own logic, I could say to you, I don't know, I think relativism is true for you, but it's false for me. What would you say? How could you respond to me? You can't, is basically what this argument is saying. And so there is a kind of serious problem for relativism, alethic relativism in particular. You can't defend it. That's kind of twisted, right? Here's a view that you can't defend. You know what that means? Well, it's not true. So that's at least what some people would have you think. So that doesn't look very good. Let me give you some other more moral implications of this kind of relativism. And this comes from Rachel's article. By the way, Rachel's was a very famous ethicist, wrote a number of articles and books on the topic. James Rachel's is his name, by the way. So it's a guy. And so let me give you a summary, a synopsis of his 1986 article. So if there really is, no objective fact of the matter that allows us to compare different cultures, that's weird because we would no longer be able to say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to maybe our own or some other one. What he's saying here is that sometimes you look at a particular practice within some culture and you think to yourself, there's no way that, morally speaking, that culture with that practice is better to a culture without that practice. Let me give you the example here. Bride kidnapping, which sounds as bad, which is as bad as it sounds, basically, is still practiced in some places. Um, just imagine two cultures, one with bride kidnapping and one without. James Rachels is saying, is it the one without bride kidnapping better? I mean, doesn't it just seem that way? Well, if you think so, then you're siding against relativism, right? And so that's one example. Let's keep going here. If it really is the case that you can't look at other cultures and judge them as inferior or superior, then you would have to just look at your own society to see whether something is right or wrong. You would be only, let me put it another way, you would only be able to look at one society, your own society, to see if something is right or wrong. And you know what? Some things in our history kind of sucked, kind of were awful, kind of were morally abhorrent. How about, I mean, I'm not even going for, top shelf here. I'm going just for segregation. There was way worse than segregation in American culture. And just stick with this one. If it really were the case that we have to go by whatever our culture says, and our culture is the only one that we can know what's right or wrong through, well, then what would you have said when you saw segregation? You would have said, well, that's our culture. That's what we do. And you wouldn't have been able to look at another culture without segregation and thought to yourself, oh, that's better. Maybe it's nice to not treat an entire class of people as, second class citizens. So, yeah, that seems a little weird. It seems strange that we can only look at our own society to figure out what's right or wrong. It seems like sometimes we do look at our own society and say, actually, I don't like that. That's wrong. So let me give you the third weird counterintuitive implication of relativism. The whole idea of moral progress is just out the window. So I think my example here is fairly good. But in Saudi Arabia, there was a ban on female driving for a long time. And then they did away with the ban on female driving. And some people said, oh, that's good. That's a form of progress. That means that they're comparing, you know, Saudi Arabia before the ban, sorry, with the ban on female driving, with Saudi Arabia without the ban on female driving, and saying that the second one is better. Well, according to relativists, you can't do that. You can't compare different spheres, right? So once it switches into the other, sphere, once the ban on female driving is lifted, then you're looking at a new cultural code. And so it seems like you can't really believe in moral progress if you're a relativist, because it's just two different spheres and you can't compare them. Well, if you're leaning against relativism, you could say, I could compare them. Here are two societies, one with a ban on female driving, one without a ban on female driving. I like the second one better. That would be to accept progress. And of course, you know, a rejection of relativism. Okay, all right. I do have another example here of it's kind of dark, which is why here's a heads up. If you want, skip ahead a whole bunch. But we're going to speak very briefly of female genital mutilation. That's what some people call it. If you want to be polite, you call it female circumcision. Um, some people want to go ahead and say that we can openly criticize this because there is no scientific reason or medical reason to do this, and it is just wrong. And so I will give you the quote. It is from Steven Pinker. And essentially, I'll try to summarize the argument. And then once we let go of this slide, you can tune back in if you want to tune out. If only one person in the world held down a terrified, struggling, screaming little girl, cut off her genitals with a septic blade, and sewed her back up, leaving only a tiny hole for urine and menstrual flow, the only question would be how severely that person should be punished and whether the death penalty would be a sufficiently severe sanction. But when millions of people do this, instead of the enormity of being magnified millions fold, suddenly it becomes culture, and thereby magically becomes less rather than more horrible, and is even defended by some Western moral thinkers, including feminists. Pinker here is saying, think about a culture with female genital mutilation and think about one without it. Clearly, the one without it is better. Why is it that this idea of culture makes it magically okay that this is done? We shouldn't give the notion of culture this magical power. We should see it, according to Pinker, for what it is, just morally atrocious. Okay, let me give you one more example here, and it's why I named this lesson When in Rome. Oh, there it is. Yeah, okay. So, if relativism is true, you can't compare today's, moral rules, moral code, moral situation with that of Rome. You can't say that ours is better than the Romans. But I'm going to tell you some things that the Romans used to do, and you're going to want to say, I'm kind of glad I don't live in that kind of world. So here is just a little bit of some of what happened in they're called Roman games, but it would be much more than games. It wouldn't just be competitions. Sometimes in these colosseums, they would have executions and other, pretty gnarly things going on, punishments, floggings, that kind of thing. So here is what Romans and their subject peoples, right, all the people that they conquered, which is a lot of people, would get together to watch executions, including, by the way, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. Here are presumably a bunch of Christians, and what they would do is they would starve very big animals and then let them go eat some Christians. Okay, that sounds pretty awful, and the Romans would gather together to watch this. Sometimes, by the way, the executions were during the lunch period. So you can imagine some people maybe grabbed a bite and then took it back to their seat to watch. I'm not sure about that, but I know that it was, during the lunch period. So, they would maybe skip lunch so they could stay there and watch these things. Floggings, I already mentioned. Gladiatorial combat. It didn't always result in death, but sometimes it would. Would you go watch a sport where you could have a reasonable expectation that at the end one of them would die? Maybe some of you would say yes. The rest of you, probably non relativists, would say no, and it is awful that that's what the Romans did. Animal baiting, animal battles, they would I don't remember which animals, but they would basically just like grab, I don't know, 4 bears and 10 alligators and then just have them battle each other and see what happens. That's real. I mean, that's what they would do. So if you are horrified at this idea of, treating animals in this way, maybe you think that our moral code is better than that of the Romans. This is my favorite, by the way, the fatal charade. So, by the way, this is all from Fagin's book. Fagin died young. He was a historian, but he would use a lot of social psychology to write his books. Very interesting writer. Anyway, fatal charades are basically reenactments of plays where the character dies, and what these people would typically they would be prisoners who were going to be executed anyways. They would actually act out the play with other actors, and when the killing happened, the killing was real. So that is bonkers, and that's what the Romans did. I'm guessing at least some of you are saying, oh, that is atrocious. If that's what you're feeling, maybe the easiest way to explain it is that you are rejecting relativism. Now, I have no idea what's going on in your mind. I'm going to just go ahead and say that it is far from obvious that alethic relativism is true. Maybe I already convinced you it's not true. I don't know. But at least for this class, let's leave it at that. Undetermined. Well, that's not good. That's bad for the relativism that we've been covering. Let me give you one more thing here. Mr. Deadpool is going to dance us into empirical data time. But basically, it seems to be the case that there are some methods by which we can study different cultures. And it's sort of obvious what they are. I mean, if you haven't thought about it so far, once I tell you this, it's going to hit you so hard, like a ton of bricks, basically. There are some norms that tend to work across different cultures and are even recognized by members of cultures previously unfamiliar with them as being superior. In other words, some kinds of reasoning, rules of reasoning, do tend to work across many, many different cultures, and some cultures that didn't know about them before, once you show these new norms to them, they recognize them as being superior. Even they're like, hey, this works. This is cool. I like it. What is that? Logic and the process of science. I mean, this should be obvious because the anthropologists who were studying different cultures and promoted this idea of relativism, what methods were they using to discover these different cultures? Well, the scientific process. So, how would you be able to get to this idea that there is an impossibility of translation between different cultures if you literally used some scientific methods to study a new culture? It seems pretty clear that if we are very careful and follow a rigorously scientific, framework, we can get to know other cultures. We can bridge the two spheres, right? And so there are norms that are, the technical jargon is cross-culturally robust. Steven Pinker has a book that defends this. And in his defense of rationality, by the way, sometimes the opposite of relativism is called rationalism. I didn't use that label here because rationalism in philosophy means a couple of different things. I can think of at least three definitions. So I'm not going to use that, right? I'm going to just say there's the relativists and there's those that deny relativism. But in his defense or in his denial of relativism, let's say, Pinker begins by noting how hunter-gatherer societies can be seen to utilize various rational tools, including, but not limited to, logical syllogisms, right? If you take a logic class, you'll learn what that is. Probabilistic Bayesian reasoning and causal reasoning. What these things are basic norms of reasoning that are integral to the scientific process. And guess what? We see them in hunter-gatherer societies, and we see them in super technologically advanced societies. In other words, they work across cultures. So there is a way to compare different cultures. It's called science. So I've already touched on this a little bit, but just consider the fieldwork of the anthropologists that inspired relativism in the first place. Aren't they assuming that their scientific methods are capable of discovering the ins and outs of other cultures, breaking past that sphere? Pretty obviously, if they're sitting there, I mean, just look at this image. If they're just sitting there, doing their thing, trying to figure out what their culture is, obviously they're assuming that they can break through and figure out what that culture is like. And so, we sum it up as this: the methods of science seem to be cross-culturally robust. There is a framework by which we can compare things. And so I'm going to go ahead and just put an X there. I mean, what else can we do, right? It doesn't seem terribly promising for uh, anyone who attempts to deny that the scientific process, is one of the best methods we've ever come up with for, inquiring into the world. So there it is.